Marcus Rivera wiped his calloused hands on his jeans as he stepped out into the blazing Arizona heat. What he couldn't have known was that the sleek white Tesla she'd been driving was worth more than his entire farm, or that the credit cards in her designer purse could buy out his family's debt 10 times over. As their eyes met across the dusty desert highway, neither realized this chance encounter would transform a struggling fourth-generation farmer and a billionaire heiress into the most unlikely partners in agricultural history. But before we dive into this incredible story of fate, fortune, and finding purpose in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button if you believe in the power of human kindness, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's discover how one broken down car changed everything. The summer of 2024 had been merciless to the Rivera family farm. Marcus stood in his withering cornfield at dawn, watching the sprinkler system sputter and fail for the third time this month. At 31, he carried the weight of 4 generations on his shoulders, 500 acres of land outside Tucson that his great-grandfather had carved from the desert with nothing but determination and a prayer. The farm was dying, not slowly, but with the brutal efficiency of unpaid bills and broken equipment. 3 months behind on the mortgage, 2 months behind on equipment loans, and his ancient irrigation system held together with duct tape and desperate hope. The bank had already sent 2 notices, one more, and the Rivera legacy would become another corporate acquisition. Marcus's great-grandfather, Eduardo Rivera, had arrived from Sonora, Mexico in 1952 with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that the American dream was real for those willing to bleed for it. He purchased this land when it was considered worthless desert, spending his first 5 years living in a tent while he hand-dug the first irrigation channels and cleared rocks under the merciless Arizona sun. The early years had been brutal. Eduardo worked construction jobs in Tucson during the day to pay for seeds and tools, then labored on his land by moonlight and during weekends. His hands were permanently stained with dirt and concrete dust, his back bent from years of stooping over young plants, protecting them from the harsh desert winds with handmade windbreaks, constructed from scrap wood and old blankets. Local farmers had called him crazy. Nothing grows in that soil, they told him at the feed store. That land's been worthless for 100 years, but Eduardo had seen something they hadn't. The soil was sandy, yes, but it drained well. The elevation was perfect for certain crops, and most importantly, there was an underground water source that ran beneath the property he'd hired a dowser to locate. It had been proven right when his first well struck sweet, clean water at 43 feet. By the 1960s, Eduardo had built the modest farmhouse that still stood today, painted white to reflect the heat, with a red tile roof that caught the morning light like fire. The house was small, but well constructed, with thick adobe walls that stayed cool in summer and warm during the desert's surprisingly cold winter nights. He'd married Maria Santos, a school teacher from Tucson whose family had initially opposed the match. They thought she was throwing away her education to marry a dirt farmer. Maria had proven them wrong. She'd not only helped Eduardo expand the farm, but had used her teaching skills to keep meticulous records of crop yields, weather patterns, and market prices together. They developed innovative irrigation techniques that maximized their water usage and started experimenting with heritage varieties of corn and beans that could thrive in the desert climate. They raised for children on vegetables grown from soil that everyone said would never produce anything worthwhile, but Eduardo had proven them wrong. By the early 1970s, the Rivera farm became known throughout southern Arizona for producing the sweetest corn, the crispest lettuce, and the most flavorful tomatoes in 3 counties. Local restaurants began requesting Rivera produce specifically, and Eduardo was able to hire his first full-time employee when Eduardo passed the farm to his son, Miguel. In 1987, it was debt-free and profitable, supporting not just the Rivera family, but employing 12 seasonal workers during harvest. The transition ceremony had been simple, but meaningful. Eduardo had walked Miguel through every acre of the property, pointing out the quirks of each field, the location of every irrigation valve, the spots where the soil was richest and where it needed more attention. Miguel had been Marcus's father, and he'd carried on the tradition with pride and innovation. Where Eduardo had been cautious and traditional, Miguel was willing to take calculated risks. He'd modernized the irrigation system in the early 90s, installing computer-controlled sprinklers that could adjust water distribution based on soil moisture readings. He built the first greenhouse on the property, allowing the farm to extend its growing season and experiment with more delicate crops. Miguel had also understood the importance of marketing. He'd started a small farmer's market stand in downtown Tucson that became locally famous for its organic produce. Every Saturday morning, Miguel would load up the truck with the week's harvest and drive into the city, where customers would line up before dawn to get the first pick of Rivera vegetables. He developed relationships with several high-end restaurants in both Tucson and Phoenix, delivering fresh produce twice a week in his refrigerated truck. The farm had thrived under Miguel's leadership. He'd expanded the greenhouse operation, added a small fruit orchard with dessert-adapted citrus trees, and even started a small side business selling Rivera-grown seeds to other farmers. He dreamed of purchasing the adjacent 200 acres when old Mr. Henderson retired, envisioning a Rivera farm that could compete with the massive agricultural operations that were beginning to dominate Arizona farming. Miguel had been an innovator, but he'd never forgotten his father's lessons about the importance of caring for the land. He'd implemented crop rotation schedules that kept the soil healthy, refused to use pesticides that might contaminate the groundwater, and maintained the old-growth mesquite trees that provided habitat for beneficial insects and birds. But then came the drought of 2011. 3 consecutive years of below-average rainfall had hit Arizona harder than anyone anticipated. The Colorado River, which supplied much of the state's water, dropped to historically low levels. Water prices skyrocketed, and many smaller farms were forced to drastically reduce their plantings or shut down. Entirely. Miguel had been determined to weather the crisis. He'd taken out loans to install more efficient irrigation systems, converted some fields to drought-resistant crops, and even invested in a small solar array to reduce electricity costs for water pumping. He believed, as his father had taught him, that hard times were temporary for those willing to adapt and persevere. The financial pressure had been enormous, but Miguel had managed to keep the farm operating. He laid off most of his seasonal workers, which had broken his heart, and had taken on additional debt to upgrade equipment. But he'd been confident that the drought would eventually break, that water prices would stabilize, and that the Rivera farm would emerge stronger than ever. The drought had finally ended in 2014, but the damage was done. Water costs remained high due to new regulations and environmental concerns. Meanwhile, massive corporate farming operations had moved into Arizona, bringing with them the kind of economy of scale that made it difficult for smaller farms to compete. These operations could afford to lose money for several years while establishing market dominance, something family farms like Rivera's couldn't match. Miguel had continued to fight, diversifying into specialty crops, pursuing organic certification, and building direct relationships with restaurants and consumers who valued locally grown, sustainably produced food. He'd started a small online business, shipping Rivera produce to customers throughout the Southwest who were willing to pay premium prices for quality and authenticity. But the margins had remained tight, and the debt load from the drought years had never fully disappeared. Miguel had worked longer hours, often laboring in the fields until well after dark, maintaining equipment himself rather than hiring mechanics, and constantly searching for new markets and opportunities. When he died suddenly of a heart attack in 2021, Marcus had been working as an agricultural engineer for a consulting firm in Phoenix. He planned to continue his father's work while bringing his own technical expertise to the farm's operations. He'd had ideas about precision agriculture, sustainable farming techniques, and even agritourism possibilities that could diversify the farm's income streams. Instead, he discovered that his father had been carrying far more debt than anyone realized. Miguel had never wanted to burden his family with financial worries, so he kept the extent of the farm's struggles to himself. The loans he'd taken during the drought, combined with equipment purchases and operating expenses, had created a debt load that made the farm's survival questionable. Marcus had left his job immediately, using his savings to keep the farm operating. While he tried to understand the full scope of the financial situation, he'd sold his condo in Phoenix, moved back into his childhood bedroom in the farmhouse, and dedicated himself to saving the family legacy. Marcus had tried everything over the past 3 years. He'd diversified crops, implementing rotation schedules that maximized soil health while producing marketable vegetables year-round. He pursued and achieved organic certification, opening up premium markets that paid higher prices for certified produce. He'd expanded the online business, developing relationships with restaurants in California and Colorado that valued the Rivera farm's reputation for quality. He'd also attempted to modernize operations using his engineering background. He'd installed soil sensors throughout the property that provided real-time data on moisture levels, nutrient content, and pH balance. He developed a smartphone app that allowed him to monitor and control irrigation systems from anywhere on the property. He'd even experimented with drone technology for crop monitoring and pest identification. But despite all his efforts, the fundamental economics remained challenging. The irrigation system that his father had modernized 30 years ago was now outdated and inefficient, wasting water that cost more every year. The greenhouse needed major repairs after a hailstorm. Last spring had damaged several panels and compromised the climate control system. Equipment that had been reliable for decades was beginning to fail more frequently, requiring expensive repairs or replacement. The worst part wasn't the financial stress, though that kept Marcus awake most nights. The worst part was knowing that 3 generations of Rivera men had poured their lives into this land, had seen it through droughts and recessions and personal tragedies, and he might be the one to lose it all. The weight of that possibility sat in his chest like a stone, growing heavier every time he opened another bill or received another notice from the bank. Marcus climbed into his 2003 Chevy Silverado, the same truck his father had bought used when Marcus graduated high school. The odometer read 287,000 miles. The air conditioning had given up during a heat wave 5 years ago, and the radio only picked up static and the local country station. The paint had faded from red to a sun-bleached pink. The bench seat was worn, smooth in spots, and the dashboard was cracked from years of Arizona sun. But the truck ran, and in a world where everything else seemed to be falling apart, that was enough. The engine still turned over every morning, the transmission shifted smoothly, and the four-wheel drive had never failed when Marcus needed to traverse rough field roads or navigate through sandy washes after storms. The truck had carried countless loads of produce to market, hauled equipment and supplies across the property. It served as Marcus's mobile office during busy seasons. He learned to maintain it himself, changing oil in the barn, replacing worn belts and hoses, and nursing along components that really should have been replaced years ago. The truck had become more than transportation. It was a symbol of the Rivera family's determination to make do, to fix what could be fixed, and to keep moving forward, even when the path seemed impossible. As he drove toward town for yet another appointment with a loan officer who would probably say no, Marcus passed landmarks that told the story of his family's journey in this harsh but beautiful land. The old water tower that his grandfather had helped build as part of a community project in 1962, when local farmers had pooled resources to ensure reliable water for everyone. The elementary school where his grandmother Maria had taught second grade for 37 years, influencing countless children from farming families throughout the region. He passed the small cemetery where 3 generations of Riveras rested under ancient mesquite trees, their graves marked with simple stones that bore names like Eduardo, Maria, and Miguel. Fresh flowers appeared on those graves regularly, placed there by community members who remembered the family's contributions to the area's agricultural heritage. This wasn't just about money or business or even the farm itself. This was about legacy, about the promise that hard work and integrity would be rewarded, about the belief that the land would provide for those who cared for it properly. Marcus's great-grandfather had bought into the American dream when it was still possible for an immigrant with strong hands and a stronger will to build something lasting. His grandfather had expanded that dream, proving that with innovation and dedication, a small farm could thrive. His father had carried it forward through increasingly difficult times, adapting and persevering when others gave up. Now Marcus was facing the possibility that the dream might die with him, not because he lacked the skills or the dedication, but because the economic realities of modern agriculture made it nearly impossible for small family farms to survive. Corporate agriculture had advantages that no amount of hard work could overcome: access to capital, economies of scale, political influence, and the ability to operate at a loss for years while establishing market dominance. As his truck carried him down the dusty highway toward another meeting that would probably end in disappointment, Marcus couldn't have imagined that his life was about to intersect with someone whose family name was on buildings across 3 continents, someone who had never worried about a mortgage payment or a failing irrigation system, but who was searching for something that all her family's wealth couldn't buy: authenticity, purpose, and a partner who valued substance over status. All Marcus knew as he drove down that empty highway was that his truck was running low on gas, his bank account was running lower, and time was running out for the Rivera family dream. The heat waves rose from the asphalt like ghosts as Marcus drove along Highway 86, 20 miles outside Tucson. The morning was already pushing 90 degrees, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. In the distance, the Catalina Mountains shimmered in the heat, their peaks barely visible through the desert haze that made everything beyond a few miles look like a mirage. The landscape on either side of the highway was classic Sonoran desert, vast expanses of sandy soil dotted with saguaro cacti, palo verde trees, and ocotillo plants that looked like giant green whips reaching toward the cloudless sky. Occasionally, Marcus passed small ranches or farms, their buildings clustered around precious wells, their fields standing out like green islands in the brown and tan ocean of desert. That's when he saw her, a white Tesla Model S, sat disabled on the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights blinking uselessly in the brilliant sunlight. The car looked completely out of place in this harsh environment, too clean, too expensive, too technological for a landscape that hadn't changed much in centuries. Beside it stood a woman who looked equally out of place, pacing back and forth, while talking animatedly into her phone. Marcus's first instinct was to keep driving. He was already running late for his appointment with the loan officer at Desert Community Bank, and his truck's temperamental cooling system meant every minute. With the windows down was another degree of heat building up inside the cab. He had his own problems to solve, and they were getting more pressing by the day. The farm couldn't afford for him to miss this meeting, even though he suspected it would end like all the others, with polite explanations about risk management and suggestions that he consider selling to one of the corporate agricultural companies that had been circling small farms throughout Arizona. But as he got closer, he could see the woman more clearly. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started to come loose in the heat. She wore white jeans and a light blue blouse. That probably cost more than Marcus's monthly grocery budget, though he didn't realize it at the time. What he did notice was that she looked genuinely distressed, gesturing frantically as she spoke, occasionally looking up and down the empty highway as if willing another car to appear. The voice of his father echoed in his memory. "Mio, you never drive past someone who needs help. That's not how we were raised, and it's not who we are." Miguel Rivera had lived by that principle throughout his life, whether it was helping neighbors bring in their harvest during labor shortages, stopping to change a tire for a stranger on a dark night, or offering his truck to transport supplies during community emergencies. It was a principle that had been passed down from Eduardo, who had learned during his early years in America that survival often depended on neighbors helping neighbors. In a harsh desert environment, leaving someone stranded wasn't just unkind, it could be dangerous. Temperatures that seemed manageable in the morning could become life-threatening by afternoon, especially for someone not accustomed to the desert climate. Marcus pulled over about 50 feet ahead of the Tesla and put his truck in park. The engine ticked as it began to cool, and the familiar smell of hot metal mixed with the sweet scent of desert sage that drifted through his open windows. He grabbed his baseball cap from the passenger seat, a faded Arizona Diamondbacks cap that had seen better days, and stepped out into the heat. The woman noticed him immediately and ended her phone call with what sounded like frustration. As Marcus walked toward her, he could see the relief in her eyes, though she remained cautious. This was, after all, a deserted stretch of highway where anything could happen, and she was clearly not from around here. "Car trouble," Marcus called out when he was still about 10 feet away, keeping his distance to avoid making her uncomfortable. His voice carried easily in the still desert air, where the only sounds were the occasional call of a cactus wren and the distant hum of his truck's engine cooling down. "Yes," she replied, her accent suggesting education and privilege, though Marcus couldn't place it exactly. There was something about her pronunciation that spoke of private schools and expensive universities, a carefully modulated tone that was probably unconscious, but marked her as clearly as if she wore a sign. "It just died while I was driving. No warning, nothing, and apparently the nearest Tesla service center is in Phoenix, which is..." She gestured helplessly at the empty landscape around them, taking in the vast expanse of desert that stretched to the horizon in every direction. To someone accustomed to urban environments, where help was always just a phone call away, the isolation, must have felt overwhelming. About 90 miles, Marcus finished for her, not exactly a quick tow. He approached slowly, noting that she relaxed slightly as she got a better look at him. Marcus was tall, but not imposing, with the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor work, dark hair that curled slightly at the edges from humidity and heat, and eyes that his grandmother had always said were the kind for his own good. His clothes marked him as clearly as hers did work boots that had seen countless days in the fields, jeans that were clean but showed the kind of wear that came from actual labor, and a t-shirt advertising the local feed store that he'd probably gotten for free with a purchase. Everything about him suggested honest work and modest means, though he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own capabilities. "I'm Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "Marcus Rivera. I farm about 15 miles back that way." He nodded in the direction he'd come from, toward land that had been in his family for 7 decades. "Victoria," she replied, taking his hand briefly. Her grip was firm, and Marcus noticed her nails were painted a subtle coral color that somehow managed to look professional and feminine at the same time. Her skin was soft in a way that spoke of office work and air conditioning, a stark contrast to his own calloused palms. "Victoria Sterling. I'm not from around here." That much was obvious. Everything about Victoria Sterling, from her perfectly styled hair to her expensive-looking watch to the way she carried herself, suggested someone who belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, not stranded on a desert highway where the nearest shade was a scraggly Palo Verde tree 50 yards away. The name Sterling tickled something in Marcus's memory, though he couldn't place it. It sounded familiar in the way that names of celebrities or politicians sometimes did something he might have heard on the news or read in a magazine. But he was to focus on the immediate problem to give it much thought. "Mind if I take a look?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the Tesla. "I'm no expert on electric vehicles, but I've fixed my share of broken-down cars over the years." Victoria hesitated for just a moment, clearly weighing whether to trust this stranger. Then she nodded, stepping aside to give him access to the car. "Please. I've tried everything I know," which admittedly isn't much. Marcus walked around the Tesla, taking in its pristine condition and probably 6-figure price tag. The car was immaculate, without a single ding or scratch, its white paint gleaming despite the dust that coated everything in the desert. The interior was all premium leather and high-tech displays that looked like something from a science fiction movie. He wasn't familiar with Tesla's specific systems, but he understood the basics of automotive troubleshooting. "Any warning lights?" Before it died, he asked, peering at the dashboard display, which showed nothing but a black screen. "Nothing," Victoria said, standing close enough that Marcus caught a hint of her perfume, something subtle and expensive that reminded him of the night-blooming cereus flowers that grew wild in the desert, blooming only once a year in the darkness. "I was just driving along, listening to music, and then everything shut off. The screen went black. The air conditioning stopped. Everything." Marcus tried a few basic diagnostic steps, checking for obvious loose connections, attempting to restart the system, looking for signs of physical damage. But it quickly became clear that whatever was wrong with the Tesla was beyond roadside repair. The car's computer systems were completely unresponsive, suggesting either a major electrical failure or a software issue that would require specialized equipment to diagnose. "This is going to need professional attention," he said, stepping back from the car and wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Could be the main battery system, could be a computer issue. Either way, you'll need a tow to someplace with Tesla-certified technicians." Victoria sighed, pushing a loose strand of hair back from her face. The gesture was unconsciously elegant, the kind of movement that suggested years of training in posture and presentation. "That's what I was afraid of. The towing company said it would be at least 3 hours before they could get someone out here, assuming they can even handle an electric vehicle." Marcus glanced at his watch, an old Timex that had belonged to his father then at the climbing sun. In 3 hours, the temperature would be well over 100 degrees. And standing on the side of a highway in that kind of heat wasn't just uncomfortable. It could be dangerous. He'd seen tourists and newcomers underestimate the desert heat, ending up in emergency rooms with heat exhaustion or worse. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Tucson," Victoria replied. "I have a meeting there this afternoon, though I'm starting to think I'll need to reschedule." There was something in the way she said meeting that suggested it was more important than she was letting on. Not just a business appointment, but something that had brought her to this remote part of Arizona for a specific purpose. Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it at the time. "I'm heading into Tucson myself," he said. "I could give you a ride if you'd like. We can call about your car from town, and you might still make your meeting." Victoria looked at Marcus, then at his dusty pickup truck with its faded paint and cracked windshield, then back at Marcus. He could see her weighing her options, waiting the desert heat for a tow truck that might not come for hours, or accept a ride from a stranger in a vehicle that looked like it had seen better days. What she couldn't know was that Marcus was offering her more than just transportation. He was offering her a glimpse into a world she'd never experienced, a world where people helped each other without expecting anything in return, where a man's word was his bond, and where success was measured not in stock portfolios or market share, but in the ability to coax life from difficult soil and leave the land better than you found it. "That's very kind of you," Victoria said finally. "Are you sure it's no trouble?" "No trouble at all," Marcus replied, and he meant it. Helping someone in need wasn't an inconvenience, it was simply what you did. "Though I should warn you, my truck's air conditioning gave up a few years ago, and the radio only picks up country music and static." Victoria smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and Marcus was struck by how it transformed her face. The worried expression melted away, replaced by genuine warmth that made her look younger and more approachable. "I think I can handle that," as she gathered her things from the Tesla leather handbag that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly truck payment, though he didn't know that, and a small overnight bag that looked like it had never seen the inside of an airport baggage compartment. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what kind of meeting would bring someone like Victoria Sterling to Tucson. She didn't look like a tourist, and she certainly didn't look like someone who belonged in the agricultural community that made up most of his social circle. Everything about her suggested urban sophistication, corporate success, and the kind of wealth that opened doors and solved problems with phone calls rather than hard work. What he couldn't have known was that Victoria Sterling wasn't just passing through Arizona. She was on a mission that had brought her to some of the most remote farming communities in the American Southwest, searching for something that all her family's wealth and influence couldn't guarantee: a partner who valued authenticity over profit, sustainability over shortcuts, and who understood that some things were worth more than their market value. As they walked toward his truck together, the morning sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky, neither Marcus nor Victoria realized they were about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about success, partnership, and what it meant to build something truly lasting in a world that seemed increasingly focused on the quick and the disposable. The interior of Marcus's truck was a stark contrast to the luxury Victoria had just left behind. As she settled into the worn bench seat, she noticed details that told the story of a working vehicle. A clipboard wedged behind the sun visor filled with delivery receipts and farm supply invoices, a thermos that had seen countless early mornings, and a small cooler in the truck bed that still held eyes from Marcus's dawn trip to check irrigation lines. The seat springs had given way in places, creating comfortable indentations that spoke of thousands of miles and countless hours spent traveling between fields, markets, and supply stores. The dashboard, cracked from years of desert sun, held a few essentials: a knife with a worn wooden handle, a small notebook with pages that curled from humidity, and a faded photograph of 3 generations of Rivera men standing in front of the same truck when it was new. "Sorry about the state of things," Marcus said as he started the engine, which turned over with a reliable rumble that spoke of careful maintenance despite its age. "This old girl's not much to look at, but she's never let me down." Victoria found herself genuinely charmed by the truck's character. "Please don't apologize. It has personality." She ran her fingers lightly over the cracked dashboard, noting how everything was clean despite showing its age. "How long have you had it?" "This truck belonged to my dad," Marcus replied, pulling back onto the highway. "He bought it used in 2003 when I graduated high school. Said every farmer needed a reliable truck, and Ford made the best work vehicles. Been in the family for 21 years now." There was pride in his voice, the kind of attachment to possessions that Victoria rarely encountered in her world, where cars were replaced every few years like fashion accessories. In her circles, a 21-year-old vehicle would be considered an antique, possibly embarrassing. But Marcus spoke about his truck the way other people talked about family heirlooms. "Your father was a farmer too?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. She'd spent the last 6 months visiting farming communities throughout the Southwest, but she'd never had the opportunity for such an intimate conversation with someone who'd grown up in agricultural life. "Fourth generation," Marcus confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of legacy. "My great-grandfather started the farm in 1952. Came up from Mexico with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work would pay off. Built it from desert scrubbing into something that could support a family." Victoria listened intently, noting how Marcus's entire demeanor changed when he talked about his family's history. The quiet worry she'd observed when he'd examined her car was replaced by something deeper. Pride mixed with responsibility, love tempered by pressure. "That's remarkable," she said softly. "For generations on the same land. That's becoming rare, isn't it?" Marcus glanced at her, surprised by the understanding in her voice. Most people outside the agricultural community didn't grasp the significance of multi-generational farming or the challenges involved in keeping family land in family hands. "It is," he admitted. "A lot of the old farms around here have been sold to corporate operations. Easier money, less risk. Can't really blame people for taking the offers when times get tough." There was something in his tone that suggested he understood those pressures personally, though he didn't elaborate. Victoria found herself wondering about the economics of small farming, something she'd been studying in theory, but was now encountering in human terms. As they drove, the landscape gradually shifted from pure desert to areas where irrigation had created pockets of green. Victoria could see the careful planning that went into desert agriculture fields positioned to take advantage of natural drainage, windbreaks strategically planted to protect crops from sandstorms, and irrigation channels that followed the natural contours of the land. "What do you grow?" she asked, noting how Marcus's attention regularly shifted to assess the fields they passed, automatically cataloging crop conditions and farming techniques even during casual conversation. "Bit of everything," Marcus replied. "Corn, tomatoes, lettuce, some specialty crops for restaurants in Phoenix and Tucson. We've got about 500 acres, which isn't huge by modern standards, but it's enough to keep me busy." Victoria did quick mental calculations. 500 acres represented significant value, but she also understood that land ownership didn't necessarily translate to liquid wealth, especially for farmers dealing with equipment costs, water rights, and market fluctuations. "Do you enjoy it?" she asked. "Farming, I mean, was it always what you wanted to do?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I went to college for agricultural engineering," he said finally. "Thought I might work for one of the big companies, help develop new farming technologies. But after graduation, I realized I missed the land, missed being part of something that my family had built." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Plus, my dad needed help with the computer systems he'd installed. Turned out he was better with plants than with technology." Victoria laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. "I can imagine. Technology can be intimidating when you're used to more hands-on work." "What about you?" Marcus asked. "What brings you to Tucson, if you don't mind me asking?" Victoria hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She'd become skilled at deflecting questions about her background and purpose, but something about Marcus's straightforward manner made her want to be more honest than usual. "I work for a company that's exploring opportunities in sustainable agriculture," she said, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of Sterling Agricultural Holdings' massive operations. "I'm here to meet with some local farmers, learn about their challenges and innovations." Marcus nodded, his interest clearly piqued. "That's fascinating. Are you looking at specific crops or more general farming practices?" "Both, really," Victoria replied. "We're interested in operations that have found ways to be both profitable and environmentally responsible. Farms that have managed to stay competitive while maintaining sustainable practices." She was genuinely interested in his perspective, though she couldn't reveal that she already knew quite a bit about his farm's operations. Sterling Agricultural Holdings had been quietly researching small to medium-sized farms throughout the Southwest, identifying operations that had managed to thrive despite the challenges facing family agriculture. The Rivera farm had caught their attention because of its consistent profitability over decades, its innovative water management techniques, and its reputation for producing premium crops that commanded higher market prices. What the research hadn't captured was the human element, the passion and knowledge that drove operations like Marcus's. "Well, you've come to the right place," Marcus said. "Arizona farmers have had to get creative to survive. Water management, soil conservation, crop selection, everything's got to be precisely calculated out here." As they talked, Victoria found herself genuinely impressed by the depth of Marcus's knowledge. He spoke casually about complex agricultural concepts, soil pH management, integrated pest control, water efficiency ratios that demonstrated both formal education and practical experience. More importantly, he talked about farming not just as a business, but as a calling. There was something in his voice when he described the satisfaction of bringing in a successful harvest, or the challenge of coaxing maximum yield from difficult soil, that spoke to a deeper connection with his work. Victoria had spent months meeting with farmers, agricultural scientists, and industry experts, but she'd rarely encountered someone who combined technical expertise with such obvious passion for the work itself. Most of the people she'd met fell into two categories: corporate farmers, who talked primarily about efficiency and profit margins, or traditionalists who resisted innovation and change. Marcus seemed to represent something different, someone who understood both the business and artistic sides of farming, who could discuss water rights, regulations, and heritage seed varieties with equal enthusiasm. As they approached the outskirts of Tucson, Marcus pointed out landmarks that were invisible to most travelers, but meaningful to anyone connected to the agricultural community. The processing plant where many local farmers brought their crops, the equipment dealer who specialized in irrigation systems, the feed store that had been family-owned for 3 generations. "It's a tight community," he explained. "Farmers help each other out when times get tough, share equipment, trade labor during harvest, pass along information about market prices and weather patterns." Victoria nodded, though she was thinking about how different this was from the corporate agricultural world she knew, where competition often prevented the kind of cooperation Marcus was describing. "That must make it easier to deal with challenges," she said. "Sometimes," Marcus agreed, "though lately, it feels like everyone's struggling with the same problems: water costs, equipment expenses, competition from large operations. Hard to help each other when everyone's barely hanging on." There was a note of frustration in his voice that made Victoria suspect the Rivera farm was facing some of the same pressures that had forced other family operations to sell to corporate buyers. As they entered Tucson proper, the landscape shifted to urban sprawl strip malls, chain restaurants, and housing developments that had consumed what was once agricultural land. Marcus navigated through the traffic with the easy confidence of someone who made this trip regularly, though Victoria noticed he seemed to wince slightly when they passed a large development that advertised luxury living on former ranch land. "Progress, I suppose," he said, following her gaze, "though it's always sad to see good agricultural land turned into subdivisions." Victoria found herself thinking about development patterns and land use policies, topics that were central to Sterling Agricultural Holdings' long-term planning. The company had been quietly acquiring agricultural land throughout the Southwest, partly as investment property and partly to ensure future food security, as climate change made farming more challenging in other regions. But sitting next to Marcus, seeing his genuine concern for the preservation of agricultural land, she felt the abstract policy discussions taking on human dimensions. Each farm that was sold and developed represented not just an economic transaction, but the end of family legacies and the loss of agricultural knowledge that had been developed over generations. "Where would you like me to drop you off?" Marcus asked as they approached downtown Tucson. Victoria gave him the address of a high-end hotel in the historic district, then immediately felt self-conscious about the choice. The hotel was expensive and exclusive, exactly the kind of place that would highlight the class differences between them. But Marcus simply nodded and adjusted his route without comment. As they pulled up in front of the hotel's elegant entrance, with its valet parking and uniformed doormen, Victoria felt the contrast between Marcus's world and her own more acutely than she had all morning. "Thank you so much for this," Victoria said as Marcus pulled up to the hotel's elegant entrance. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate your kindness." Marcus waved off her thanks with the casual gesture of someone unaccustomed to being praised for doing what he considered basic human decency. "It was nothing. I hope you can get your car sorted out without too much trouble." Victoria hesitated, her hand on the door handle. Something about this moment felt significant, though she couldn't quite articulate why. She'd been helped by strangers before, usually people who recognized her name or sensed an opportunity for networking, but Marcus's assistance had been completely without agenda. "Is there anything I can do to repay you?" she asked. "At least, let me cover your gas." Or absolutely not, Marcus interrupted gently but firmly. "I was heading into town anyway. Besides, my dad would roll over in his grave if he knew I'd taken money for helping someone who was stranded." The reference to his father carried weight, suggesting values that had been passed down through generations. Victoria found herself genuinely moved by this glimpse into a world where helping others was simply expected, not calculated. "Well, then at least let me buy you lunch," she insisted. "It's the least I can do." Marcus glanced at his watch, the same worn Timex that had belonged to his father, and Victoria could see him calculating whether he had time. She suspected he was thinking about the meeting that had brought him to town, probably something important related to his farm's operations. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I've got an appointment I can't miss." Rain check. There was something in his tone when he mentioned the appointment to tension that suggested it wasn't something he was looking forward to. Victoria wondered if it might be related to the financial pressures he'd hinted at earlier, but she didn't feel comfortable prying. "Of course," she said, though she found herself disappointed by his refusal. The conversation during their drive had been the most genuine interaction she'd had in months, and she wasn't ready for it to end. As she gathered her belongings, Marcus got out of the truck and came around to help her with her baggage gesture. That was probably automatic for him, but struck Victoria as increasingly rare in her experience. When was the last time someone had opened a door for her without being paid to do so? "I hope your meeting goes well," she said as they stood beside the truck. "Thanks," Marcus replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't optimistic about the outcome. "And I hope you can get your car fixed quickly. That's not the kind of problem you want to deal with when you're far from home." Victoria was struck again by his genuine concern for her welfare. In her world, conversations were often performative, filled with pleasantries that didn't reflect actual interest or care. But Marcus seemed authentically worried about her situation, despite having solved the immediate problem by giving her a ride. "Actually," she said impulsively, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in having dinner tonight. I mean, if you're free, I'd love to hear more about farming in Arizona. And I still owe you for the ride." Marcus looked surprised by the invitation, and Victoria immediately wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. Perhaps dinner seemed forward too much, like she was trying to turn his good deed into something more personal. "I mean, purely professional," she added quickly. "I'm genuinely interested in learning about local agricultural practices. And you clearly know the industry well." Marcus studied her face for a moment. Seeming to weigh her sincerity, Victoria had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing through her carefully constructed professional persona to something more authentic underneath. "I'd like that," he said finally, "though I should warn you, I'm not much for fancy restaurants. I know a place that serves good food, but it's nothing like." He gestured vaguely at the upscale hotel behind them. "That sounds perfect," Victoria assured him, meaning it more than he could know. "I've been eating in hotel restaurants for weeks. Something authentic would be a welcome change." They agreed to meet at 7 o'clock at a Mexican restaurant called Casa Rivera, no relation to Marcus's family, despite the name that he promised served the best green chili in Tucson. As Victoria watched him drive away in his weathered truck, she found herself looking forward to the evening in a way that surprised her. For the past 6 months, her dinner meetings had been business obligations, carefully orchestrated events designed to gather information or build relationships that could benefit Sterling Agricultural Holdings. Tonight would be different, a chance to continue a conversation with someone who clearly had no idea who she was or what she represented. The hotel lobby was everything Victoria had expected: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and staff who recognized the subtle signs of wealth and privilege. As she checked in, she found herself thinking about the contrast between this environment and the genuine warmth of Marcus's truck. Her suite was elegantly appointed with views of the Santa Catalina Mountains and amenities that cost more per night than many people earned in a week. But as she looked out at the landscape where Marcus lived and worked, Victoria found herself more interested in the farms visible in the distance than in the luxury surrounding her. She spent the afternoon making phone calls related to her car and her official business in Tucson. But her thoughts kept returning to her conversation with Marcus. There had been something refreshing about talking to someone who wasn't trying to impress her, who wasn't angling for anything beyond basic human connection. In her world, every conversation was layered with subtext: people wanting jobs, contracts, investments, or simply access to the Sterling family's network of influence. She'd grown skilled at navigating these interactions, but she'd also grown tired of them. Marcus had treated her simply as Victoria, a stranded motorist who needed help. He'd shown genuine interest in her questions about farming, but not the kind of calculated attention she usually received from people who recognized her potential value to their careers or businesses. As evening approached, Victoria found herself taking unusual care with her appearance. Not the kind of strategic presentation she perfected for business meetings, but something more authentic. She chose jeans and a simple blouse, jewelry that was elegant but not ostentatious, makeup that enhanced rather than created. Looking in the mirror, she realized she was dressing to fit into Marcus's world rather than to stand out in her own. A reversal that felt both strange and liberating. Casa Rivera turned out to be exactly what Marcus had promised: a family-owned restaurant that prioritized flavor over presentation. With mismatched chairs and tables that had been scarred by decades of use, the walls were covered with photographs of local families and community events, creating an atmosphere that felt more like someone's home than a commercial establishment. Marcus was already waiting when Victoria arrived, looking slightly uncomfortable, in what were clearly his best jeans and a button-down shirt that had been carefully pressed. He stood when he saw her, another gesture that spoke to values that were becoming increasingly rare. "This place doesn't look like much," he said apologetically, "but the food is incredible. The Morales family has been running it for 30 years. It's perfect," Victoria assured him, and she meant it. The restaurant felt real in a way that the trendy establishment she usually frequented never did. She could see families celebrating birthdays, couples on dates, groups of friends catching up over beer and conversation. It was the kind of place where people came not to be seen, but simply to enjoy good food and genuine company. They were seated at a corner table that gave them privacy for conversation, while still allowing them to observe the restaurant's bustling atmosphere. Victoria noticed how several people greeted Marcus as they passed, suggesting he was a regular customer who was genuinely liked by the community. "So tell me," Victoria said after they'd ordered Marcus, insisting she try the green chili enchiladas that were his personal favorite. "What's the biggest challenge facing farmers in Arizona right now?" It was a question she'd asked dozens of times during her research, but she found herself genuinely curious about Marcus's perspective. He thought for a moment, taking the question seriously rather than giving her a prepared response. "Water," he said finally. "Everything else we can adapt to: market prices, equipment costs, even climate change to some extent. But water is the foundation of everything we do, and it's getting more expensive and less reliable every year." He went on to explain the complex web of water rights, environmental regulations, and political pressures that govern agricultural water use in Arizona. Victoria was impressed by his sophisticated understanding of policy issues that affected his daily operations, though she noticed he spoke about these challenges with resignation rather than anger. "It must be frustrating," she said, "feeling like your livelihood depends on factors you can't control." Marcus nodded, though his expression suggested he'd made peace with this reality. "That's farming, to some extent. You learn to work with what you have and adapt to what you can't change. My great-grandfather dealt with dust storms and economic depression. My grandfather navigated water disputes and labor shortages. My father survived droughts and corporate competition. Each generation faces different challenges, and what challenges are you facing?" Victoria asked softly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria wondered if she pushed too far into personal territory. But then he began to speak, and she realized he was simply choosing his words carefully. "Same as everyone else, mostly," he said, "trying to balance what the land can sustainably produce with what the market demands, maintaining equipment that's getting older and more expensive to repair, figuring out how to compete with operations that have advantages of scale and capital that I'll never have." There was something in his tone that suggested these challenges were more than theoretical, but Victoria didn't press for details. She was beginning to understand that Marcus was proud, and pride might prevent him from admitting just how difficult his situation had become. Their conversation continued through dinner, ranging from technical discussions about soil management to more philosophical questions about the role of agriculture in society. Victoria found herself genuinely engaged in a way that surprised her. Marcus challenged her assumptions about farming, while showing genuine interest in her perspectives on business and sustainability. As the evening progressed, Victoria became increasingly aware that she was enjoying herself in a way that had nothing to do with business networking or information gathering. Marcus was intelligent, passionate about his work, and possessed a kind of authenticity that was rare in her professional circles. More than that, he treated her as an intellectual equal while showing the kind of respect and consideration that spoke to deeply held values about how people should treat each other. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions about her work, and showed genuine curiosity about her perspective on the agricultural issues they discussed. When the check arrived, Victoria insisted on paying despite Marcus's protests. "You rescued me from a very unpleasant situation this morning," she said firmly. "This is a small way of saying thank you," Marcus finally agreed, though she could tell it went against his instincts to let someone else pay for his meal. As they walked out into the warm desert evening, Victoria found herself reluctant for the evening to end. "This was wonderful," she said as they reached her rental car, a modest sedan that she'd arranged to be delivered to the restaurant. "Thank you for showing me a real Tucson restaurant." "Thank you for dinner," Marcus replied, "and for the company. It's been a while since I've had a chance to talk about farming with someone who asked such thoughtful questions." They stood for a moment in the parking lot, both seeming to sense that something significant had happened during their conversation, though neither was quite sure what to call it. "I hope your meeting went well today," Victoria said finally. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Not as well as I'd hoped," he admitted. "But that's not your problem to worry about." Victoria wanted to ask for details, to offer help if she could, but she sensed that Marcus wouldn't welcome such an offer from someone he just met. Instead, she simply said, "I'm sorry to hear that. Will you be in Tucson long?" Marcus asked. Changing the subject, "A few more days," Victoria replied. "I'd have meetings with several other farmers in the area. Well, if you need any recommendations for places to visit, or if you have questions about local agricultural practices, feel free to call," Marcus said, handing her a business card that was clearly homemade. Printed on a basic computer and cut slightly unevenly, the card read simply, "Rivera Family Farm, Marcus Rivera, owner, operator," followed by a phone number and email address. Victoria found the simplicity refreshing. After years of receiving elaborately designed business cards that were more about image than information, "I will," she promised, meaning it. "And Marcus, thank you again for today, for everything." As she drove back to her hotel, Victoria found herself thinking about the evening in ways that had nothing to do with her official mission in Arizona. She'd come to Tucson to gather information about regional farming operations, to identify potential acquisition targets for Sterling Agricultural Holdings. Instead, she'd met someone who challenged her assumptions about what success looked like, who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, and who'd given her the most genuine conversation she'd had in months. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria found herself wondering what it would be like to live a life guided by values other than profit and expansion, to be part of a community where people helped each other simply because it was the right thing to do. As she fell asleep in her luxury hotel suite, she was already looking forward to seeing Marcus again, though she couldn't have articulated exactly why or what she hoped might come from such a meeting. Victoria woke the next morning with an unusual sense of anticipation. She'd scheduled meetings with 3 other farmers in the Tucson area, part of her systematic research into regional agricultural operations. But she found herself hoping for an excuse to see Marcus again. Her phone showed the missed calls from her assistant in New York and a text message from the Tesla service center, confirming that her car would need several days for repairs. Apparently, a software failure had cascaded through multiple systems, requiring specialized diagnostic equipment and replacement parts that had to be shipped from California. Instead of feeling frustrated by the delay, Victoria found herself oddly pleased. The extra time in Tucson would give her more opportunity to understand the local farming community, she told herself, though she was honest enough to admit that her interests had become more personal than professional. She was finishing breakfast in the hotel restaurant when her phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and she felt an unexpected flutter of excitement. "Good morning," she answered, perhaps a bit too eagerly. "Morning, Victoria. I hope I'm not calling too early." Marcus's voice carried that note of consideration that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I wanted to check how things went with your car." Victoria explained the diagnosis and repair timeline, and she could hear genuine sympathy in Marcus's response. "That's tough," he said, "being stranded without your own transportation in an unfamiliar place. Listen, I know you mentioned having meetings with other farmers in the area. If you need rides, or just want someone to show you around, I'd be happy to help. I know most of the agricultural operations within 50 miles of here." The offer was clearly sincere, made without any expectation of reciprocation. Victoria found herself smiling at his thoughtfulness. "That's incredibly kind of you," she said, "but I don't want to impose on your time. You must be busy with your own farm." "Actually," Marcus said, and she could hear a note of frustration in his voice, "I'm in a bit of a forced break from normal operations. My irrigation system had another major failure yesterday afternoon, and I'm waiting for parts that won't arrive until Friday, so I've got some unexpected free time." Victoria sensed there was more to the story, perhaps financial pressures. That made equipment repairs a significant burden, but she didn't press for details. "In that case," she said, "I love the company and the local expertise. I have a meeting this morning with a farm about 30 miles south of Tucson. Do you know the Henderson operation?" There was a pause before Marcus answered, and when he spoke, his tone was carefully neutral. "I know Jim Henderson. Good man. Been farming the land for about 15 years. Built it up from nothing into a pretty successful operation. Something in his voice suggested there was more to say about Henderson, but Marcus seemed reluctant to elaborate. Victoria made a mental note to explore that dynamic when they met. "Would you like me to pick you up at your hotel?" Marcus offered. "Actually," Victoria said impulsively, "would you mind if I came out to see your farm first? I'd love to understand the land and the challenges you've been describing." Another pause. Longer this time. Victoria could almost hear Marcus considering whether to invite a relative stranger to see his struggling operation. "I'd like that," he said finally, "though I should warn you, we're not exactly looking our best right now. The irrigation problems have stressed some of the crops, and everything's a bit chaotic while I'm waiting for repairs. I'd love to see it exactly as it is," Victoria assured him. "Real farming, not a showcase." They arranged for Victoria to drive out to the Rivera farm mid-morning, after Marcus had completed his early irrigation checks. As she hung up, Victoria realized she was looking forward to the visit with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with her official research mission. The drive to the Rivera farm took Victoria through landscape that was becoming familiar. Vast expanses of desert punctuated by carefully cultivated fields that stood out like green islands in the brown and tan vastness. She followed Marcus's detailed directions down increasingly rural roads until she reached a weathered wooden sign that read Rivera Family Farm, Estate, 1952. The entrance to the property was marked by an impressive row of eucalyptus trees that must have been planted decades ago, their silver-green leaves providing shade and windbreak for the farmhouse beyond. As Victoria drove down the dirt lane, she could see the evidence of for generations of careful stewardship: mature shade trees strategically placed around buildings, established windbreaks protecting fields from desert storms, and a kind of thoughtful landscape design that spoke to long-term planning and deep connection to the land. The farmhouse itself was modest but well-maintained, painted white to reflect the desert heat with a red tile roof that had weathered to a warm terracotta. A wide porch wrapped around the front and sides of the house, providing outdoor living space that made sense in the desert climate. Gardens near the house showed the same careful attention as the farm field's drought-resistant plants that added beauty while requiring minimal water. Marcus emerged from a large barn as Victoria parked near the house. He was dressed for work in boots, jeans, and a t-shirt that showed the signs of morning labor, and he looked completely at home in this environment. Seeing him here, Victoria could better understand the deep connection to place that had colored all their conversations. "Welcome to the Rivera farm," he said, approaching her car with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "I hope you found the place all right. Your directions were perfect," Victoria assured him, stepping out of her rental car and taking in the immediate surroundings. "This is beautiful, Marcus. You can feel the history here." Marcus looked around as if seeing the place through her eyes. and Victoria could see pride mixed with worry in his expression. "My great-grandfather planted those eucalyptus trees the year after he bought the land," he said, gesturing toward the impressive windbreak. "Said a farm needed to look established, not like some temporary operation that might blow away in the next dust storm." Victoria could see the wisdom in that philosophy, and she was beginning to understand how for generations of careful planning had created the mature, established feeling of the property. "Would you like the full tour?" Marcus asked. "I should warn you, it's not the best time to see things. We're between crops in some fields, and the irrigation problems have stressed the summer plantings." "I'd love to see everything," Victoria replied, "including the problems. I'm trying to understand the real challenges of farming in this climate, not just the success stories." Marcus nodded approvingly, as if her answer had passed some kind of test. "In that case, let's start with the disaster," he said with a rueful smile. "Then we can work our way up to the parts that are actually functioning." He led her toward the fields, explaining the layout of the property as they walked. Victoria was impressed by the sophisticated water management system that Eduardo Rivera had begun, and successive generations had refined and expanded. Even in its current disabled state, she could see the careful engineering that had been required to make desert agriculture viable. The original system was all manual, Marcus explained as they reached the main irrigation control station, a small building that housed pumps, filters, and computerized control systems. "My great-grandfather would open and close valves by hand, walking the entire property twice a day during growing season. My grandfather added the first automated timers in the 60s, and my father installed computer controls in the 90s. Victoria could see where recent repairs had been attempted new connections that stood out against weathered pipes, patches that spoke to ongoing maintenance challenges. "What exactly failed?" she asked, noting how Marcus's expression grew tense as he looked at the disabled system. "Cascade failure," he said with the kind of frustration that came from dealing with a complex problem that had no simple solution. "Started with a pump bearing, which caused vibrations that loosened other connections. By the time I caught it, we lost pressure throughout the southern section, which caused automatic shutoffs that affected the computer controls." He opened a panel to show her the computerized control system's sophisticated equipment that represented significant investment, but which was clearly several generations behind current technology. "The problem is, when you're dealing with older systems, one failure often leads to others," Marcus continued. "And parts for equipment this age are getting harder to find and more expensive to replace." Victoria nodded, understanding both the technical challenges and the financial pressures Marcus was facing. In her world, equipment failures were inconveniences quickly resolved with phone calls and checkbook solutions. Here, a breakdown could threaten an entire season's crops and the economic survival of the operation. "How long until you can get it running again?" she asked. "Parts should arrive Friday, if the supplier doesn't have more delays," Marcus replied. "But that's assuming the repairs work as planned. If we run into complications," he shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Victoria could see the stress this uncertainty was causing. In farming, timing was everything, and delays during critical growing periods could have consequences that lasted far beyond the immediate problem. "In the meantime, what are you doing for water?" she asked. Marcus gestured toward a collection of portable sprinklers and hoses that were scattered around the nearest field. "Manual irrigation takes about 12 hours a day to cover what the automated system could do in 3 hours, but it keeps the plants alive." The scope of additional labor required was staggering, and Victoria realized that Marcus was probably working 18-hour days to compensate for the equipment failure. "That must be exhausting," she said. "Temporary problem," Marcus replied with the kind of determined optimism that probably helped farmers survive difficult seasons. "Though I admit it's given me new appreciation for what my great-grandfather went through when everything was done by hand." As they continued the tour, Victoria began to understand the full scope of the Rivera farm operation. The property was larger and more complex than she'd initially realized, with different fields dedicated to various crops based on soil conditions, water requirements, and market demand. Marcus showed her heritage corn varieties that his family had been growing for 3 generations, tomato fields that supplied several high-end restaurants, and experimental plots where he was testing crops that might be better adapted to changing climate conditions. "Climate change is real out here," he said as they examined plants that were clearly stressed by extreme heat. Temperatures are higher, rainfall patterns are less predictable, and we're seeing weather events that are outside historical norms. Victoria was impressed by his willingness to acknowledge and adapt to changing conditions, rather than simply hoping they would return to previous patterns. "How are you adapting?" she asked. "Variety selection, mostly," Marcus replied, "trying to identify plants that can handle more heat and less water while still producing marketable crops. It's a constant experiment." He showed her a small greenhouse where he was propagating plants for field trials, explaining his systematic approach to testing new varieties under controlled conditions. "Before committing field space to them, my degree is in agricultural engineering," he explained, "but half of farming is really biological research. You're constantly trying to optimize the interaction between plants, soil, water, and climate." Victoria found herself fascinated by the complexity of what Marcus was doing. She'd understood farming in abstract terms as an industry with inputs, outputs, and profit margins, but seeing it through Marcus's eyes revealed the intricate web of biological, technical, and economic factors that had to be balanced for success. "Do you ever think about expanding?" she asked as they walked through a particularly impressive tomato field. "This operation seems like it could support additional acreage." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Victoria sensed she touched on a sensitive topic. "Expansion requires capital," he said finally, "and right now, I'm focused on maintaining what we have rather than growing larger." There was something in his tone that suggested financial constraints were limiting his options, though he seemed reluctant to discuss the details. "The economics of small farming are challenging," Victoria observed carefully. "They are," Marcus agreed, "especially when you're competing with operations that have advantages of scale and access to capital that family farms don't have." Victoria wanted to ask more about his specific situation, but she sensed that Marcus's pride might prevent him from discussing financial difficulties with someone he'd recently met. Instead, she focused on the technical aspects of his operation, asking questions about crop rotation, soil management, and water conservation techniques. Marcus's answers revealed not just deep knowledge, but genuine passion for the work he was doing. As the morning progressed, Victoria found herself increasingly impressed by both the sophistication of the Rivera farm operation and Marcus's expertise in managing it. This wasn't the simple, traditional farming operation she might have expected, but a complex agricultural business that required constant innovation and adaptation. More than that, she was drawn to Marcus's approach to challenges. Rather than complaining about difficulties or looking for someone to blame, he focused on finding solutions and adapting to changing conditions. There was a resilience and optimism in his outlook that she found both admirable and attractive. By the time they finished touring the farm, it was nearly noon, and Victoria realized she'd completely lost track of time. Her scheduled meeting with Jim Henderson wasn't until 2 o'clock, leaving them with unexpected time together. "Would you like some lunch?" Marcus asked as they returned to the farmhouse. "Nothing fancy, but I can put together some sandwiches." Victoria accepted eagerly, curious to see the inside of the house that had sheltered for generations of Rivera families. Marcus led her through a side door into a kitchen that was clearly the heart of the home, large enough for serious cooking, with well-worn counters and appliances that showed their age, but were obviously well-maintained. The kitchen opened into a dining area and living room that felt both comfortable and lived in. Furniture that had probably been purchased decades ago was still in good condition, suggesting quality construction and careful maintenance. Family photographs covered nearly every available surface, creating a visual history of the Rivera family's life on this land. Victoria found herself drawn to the photographs, particularly those showing the evolution of the farm over the decades. Black and white images from the 1950s showed Eduardo Rivera standing proudly beside newly planted fields. Color photographs from the 1970s and 80s captured family celebrations and community events. More recent pictures showed Marcus with his father working together on various farm projects. "This is wonderful," Victoria said, studying a photograph of 3 generations of Rivera men standing beside the same truck Marcus now drove, taken when it was new. "You can see the pride and continuity in these faces." Marcus smiled as he prepared their lunch, clearly pleased by her appreciation of his family's history. "My grandmother was the photographer," he explained. "She insisted on documenting everything: first harvests, new equipment, family milestones. Said someday we'd be glad to have the record." Victoria could see the wisdom in that philosophy, as she found herself thinking about her own family's legacy. The Sterling family had a long history of business success, but their documentation focused more on corporate achievements than personal relationships or family traditions. "Tell me about growing up here," Victoria said as Marcus handed her a sandwich made with vegetables that had clearly been grown on the property. "What was it like being part of this kind of operation?" Marcus settled into a chair across from her, and Victoria could see him organizing his thoughts before answering. "Busy," he said with a smile, "especially during planting and harvest seasons. My father believed that understanding the work was essential, even if I eventually chose a different career. So I learned to drive the tractor when I was 12, started managing my own experimental plots when I was 14. Victoria tried to imagine what that kind of childhood would have been like growing up with such clear connection to the land and understanding of where food actually came from. "Was there pressure to take over the farm?" she asked. "Some," Marcus admitted, though my father was careful not to make it feel like an obligation. He wanted me to choose farming because I loved it, not because I felt trapped by family expectations. "And did you love it?" "I mean," Marcus considered the question seriously. "Yes and no," he said finally. "I loved the land, loved understanding how plants grow and how natural systems work. But I also wanted to see what else was out there, to get an education and maybe work on larger scale projects." "What changed your mind?" "My father got sick during my senior year of college," Marcus said quietly. "I came home to help during harvest season and realized how much I'd missed this place, the connection to something larger than myself, the satisfaction of producing something essential, the feeling of being part of a community where what you do actually matters." Victoria heard echoes of her own struggles with purpose and meaning in his words, though her context was completely different. "Do you ever regret the choice?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out the kitchen window toward fields that represented both his family's legacy and his personal challenges. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "especially when I'm dealing with equipment failures or market pressures that are beyond my control. There are days when working for a larger company with regular salary and benefits seems very appealing." Victoria understood that temptation, though from the opposite direction. In her world, the security of corporate success often felt hollow compared to the kind of meaningful work Marcus was describing. "But then I walk through the fields in the morning, or see a successful harvest come in, or have a conversation with a restaurant chef who specifically requests our tomatoes because they know how they're grown," Marcus continued, "and I remember why this matters." Victoria found herself moved by his articulation of purpose and meaning in work. That was clearly challenging and sometimes thankless. "It sounds like you found something rare," she said softly, "work that connects to your values and makes a real difference." Marcus nodded, then looked at her with curiosity. "What about you? Do you feel that connection to your work?" The question caught Victoria off guard. In her world, work was about achievement, advancement, and financial success. The idea of work as expression of values or source of personal meaning was something she'd rarely considered. "It's complicated," she said carefully. "I'm fortunate to work for a company that has resources to make a real impact in agriculture, but sometimes the scale of corporate operations can feel impersonal." It was as close to honesty as she could manage without revealing her true identity and the nature of her mission in Arizona. "I imagine that's challenging," Marcus said with genuine understanding, "trying to maintain personal values within large organizational structures." Victoria was struck by his insight into her situation. Even with the limited information she provided, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a pickup truck in the farmyard. Through the kitchen window, Victoria could see an older man getting out of a vehicle that looked even more weathered than Marcus's truck. "That's Frank Morales," Marcus explained, rising to greet his visitor. "Neighboring farmer. Probably wants to borrow some equipment or coordinate on a water delivery." Victoria watched through the window as Marcus walked out to meet Frank, noting the easy familiarity between the two men. Their conversation was brief but animated, with both men gesturing toward different areas of their respective properties. When Marcus returned to the kitchen, his expression was troubled. "Everything okay?" Victoria asked. "Frank's having his own irrigation problems," Marcus explained, "wondering if I had any spare parts that might help him through until he can get repairs done properly." Victoria could see Marcus calculating whether he could spare equipment that he might need for his own emergency repairs. Were you able to help him? I gave him a couple of valve assemblies. That should get him through the next few days, Marcus said. Sometimes that's all you can do, help each other survive until things get better. Victoria was struck by the generosity of the gesture, especially given Marcus's own equipment challenges. Isn't that risky? She asked. What if you need those parts for your own repairs? Marcus shrugged with the kind of acceptance that seemed characteristic of his approach to challenges. Frank's been a good neighbor for 15 years, he said simply. Helped me out plenty of times when I was getting started after my father died. You help each other when you can and trust that it comes back when you need it. Victoria found herself thinking about the contrast between Marcus's community-oriented approach and the competitive dynamics that characterize her corporate world, where helping potential competitors was often seen as strategic weakness. That's a beautiful philosophy, she said, though I imagine it doesn't always work out fairly. No. Marcus agreed. Sometimes you help people who don't reciprocate, or you make sacrifices that don't get recognized. But the alternative is everyone struggling alone, and that's worse for everyone. Victoria was beginning to understand that Marcus's approach to farming was about more than just producing crops. It was about maintaining a way of life that valued community cooperation and mutual support. As they finished lunch, Victoria found herself reluctant to leave for her appointment with Jim Henderson. The morning at the Rivera farm had given her insights into agricultural life that went far beyond technical farming practices. I should probably head to my meeting with Henderson, she said finally, checking her watch. I'll ride along if that's still okay, Marcus said. Jim's operation might be interesting for you to see. He's taken a different approach to dessert farming than we have. There was something in Marcus's tone when he mentioned Henderson that suggested professional differences rather than personal conflict. Different how? Victoria asked, as they walked toward her rental car, more focused on volume and efficiency than sustainability. Marcus said diplomatically, Jim's built a successful business, but his methods wouldn't work for our operation. Victoria sensed there were philosophical differences about farming practices that went beyond simple business strategy, but Marcus seemed reluctant to criticize. A neighbor directly. As they drove toward the Henderson farm, Victoria found herself processing everything she learned during the morning. The Rivera farm represented exactly the kind of operation that Sterling Agricultural Holdings had been studying, small enough to be potentially available for acquisition, sophisticated enough to be valuable, but struggling with the kind of financial pressures that might force a sale. But spending time with Marcus had complicated her perspective on what such an acquisition would really mean. This wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a family legacy, a way of life, and a vital part of a community that depended on mutual support and cooperation. For the first time since beginning her research project, Victoria found herself questioning whether Sterling Agricultural Holdings' expansion strategy was really the best approach to supporting sustainable agriculture. The Henderson farm, when they reached it, provided a stark contrast to the Rivera operation, where Marcus's property felt established and organic, with buildings and fields that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. Henderson's farm looked aggressively modern and efficient. Large metal buildings housed equipment that was clearly newer and more expensive than anything Victoria had seen at the Rivera farm. Fields were laid out in precise geometric patterns that maximized machine efficiency, and irrigation systems featured the latest in computerized control technology. Jim Henderson himself reinforced the impression of success and expansion. He was probably in his early 50s, dressed in clean work clothes that suggested supervisory rather than hands-on labor, and he greeted Victoria with the kind of professional confidence that came from financial security. Welcome to Henderson Agricultural, he said, shaking hands with both Victoria and Marcus. I understand you're researching farming operations in the region. Victoria confirmed her interest, noting that Henderson's approach to the conversation was more formal and business-oriented than Marcus's had been. Well, you've come to the right place, Henderson continued. We're one of the most successful mid-size operations in southern Arizona. Always happy to share what we've learned about efficient dessert agriculture. As Henderson began his tour, Victoria found herself comparing his operation to what she'd seen at the Rivera farm. Henderson's approach was impressive in its scale and technical sophistication, but it felt more like an industrial operation than the agricultural ecosystem that Marcus had created. The differences became more apparent as Henderson explained his farming philosophy, which focused heavily on maximizing yield per acre and minimizing labor costs through automation and chemical inputs. The key to profitability in modern agriculture is efficiency, Henderson explained as they toured his main growing facility. You've got to produce the maximum amount of marketable crops with a minimum input of time and resources. Victoria could see Marcus listening politely, but not engaging enthusiastically with Henderson's presentation. She sensed that the two men represented different philosophies about what farming should be and how it should relate to the broader community. As the tour continued, Victoria found herself increasingly appreciating the more holistic approach that Marcus had shown her. Henderson's operation was certainly profitable and efficient, but it lacked the sense of connection to place and community that had made the Rivera farm feel special. More importantly, she realized that her growing interest in Marcus and his operations had less to do with business opportunities and more to do with the man himself, his integrity, his dedication to something larger than personal profit, and his ability to find meaning and purpose in work that was challenging and often thankless. By the time they left Henderson's farm, Victoria knew that her mission in Arizona had taken on dimensions that had nothing to do with corporate acquisition strategies. She was falling for both Marcus and the way of life he represented, even though she hadn't yet found the courage to tell him who she really was. Over the next 3 days, Victoria and Marcus fell into an easy routine that felt natural despite having known each other for less than a week. Marcus's irrigation parts had been delayed again, leaving him with more free time than usual, and Victoria found excuses to extend her stay in Tucson. Her official research could have been completed in 2 days, but she told herself she was gathering deeper insights into regional agricultural practices. The truth was more complicated. Victoria had never experienced the kind of authentic connection she was developing with Marcus. In her world of corporate boardrooms and strategic networking, relationships were carefully calculated investments. People were either useful contacts, potential allies, or obstacles to be managed. The idea of spending time with someone simply because you enjoyed their company was foreign to her professional experience. Yet that's exactly what was happening with Marcus. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions about sustainable farming to more personal topics about dreams, disappointments, and the search for meaning in work and life. Victoria found herself sharing thoughts and feelings that she'd never articulated to anyone. Drawn out by Marcus's genuine interest and non-judgmental listening, on Thursday evening, they sat on the porch of the Rivera farmhouse watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. Victoria had brought dinner from a restaurant in Tucson, a gesture that Marcus had initially protested but eventually accepted. When she insisted it was her turn to provide the meal, "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus said as they finished eating, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when approaching topics that might be sensitive. "Of course," Victoria replied, though she felt a flutter of anxiety about what he might ask. "You mentioned working for a company involved in sustainable agriculture," Marcus said, "but you never talk about the details of your work. Are you not allowed to discuss it? Or is it just not something you're passionate about?" Victoria felt the familiar tension of trying to balance honesty with the need to protect her true identity. She'd been dreading this moment while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. Marcus was too intelligent and too observant to accept vague explanations indefinitely. "It's complicated," she said carefully. "My company is large, and sometimes the corporate perspective on agriculture feels disconnected from what I've been learning here." "How so?" Marcus asked, settling back in his chair with the patience of someone genuinely interested in understanding. Victoria chose her words carefully, trying to stay as close to the truth as possible. "The company I work for focuses on acquisition and efficiency," she said. "They see farming operations primarily as business assets, things to be optimized for maximum return on investment. But spending time here, talking to you and other farmers, I'm beginning to understand that farms are more than just businesses. They're communities, legacies, ways of life." Marcus nodded slowly, and Victoria could see understanding in his eyes. "I've dealt with companies like that," he said quietly. "Had several approaches over the years from firms wanting to buy our land. They always talk about maximizing the property's potential or bringing operations up to modern efficiency standards." Victoria felt a chill of recognition and guilt. That language sounded uncomfortably familiar, exactly the kind of terminology Sterling Agricultural Holdings used when discussing acquisition targets. How do you respond to those approaches? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Politely decline, Marcus said with a slight smile. Though I understand why some farmers accept, the money is usually good, and farming is getting harder every year. Sometimes selling to a corporate buyer is the only way to ensure your family's financial security. Victoria found herself thinking about the research files she had on dozens of farms throughout the Southwest operations that Sterling Agricultural Holdings had identified as potential acquisitions. Each file contained financial analysis, production, data, and strategic assessments, but nothing about the human stories behind the numbers. Do you ever worry about having to make that choice yourself? She asked softly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light was fading from the desert sky. Every day, he admitted finally, the economics of small farming are brutal. Equipment costs keep rising, water prices increase every year, and you're always one bad season or major breakdown away from financial disaster. Victoria wanted to ask about his specific situation, to understand the full scope of the pressures he was facing, but she sensed that Marcus's pride might prevent him from discussing details with someone he'd recently met. Is there anything that could help? She asked instead. Government programs, agricultural cooperatives, new technologies? Marcus smiled ruefully. Lots of things could help if I had the capital to implement them. Modern irrigation systems, solar power, greenhouse expansions, direct marketing infrastructure. The knowledge exists, and some of the programs you mentioned do offer support. But everything requires upfront investment that's hard to justify when you're already stretched thin. Victoria found herself mentally calculating what it would cost to implement the improvements Marcus was describing. The amounts were substantial from a farming perspective, but relatively modest in corporate terms, probably less than Sterling Agricultural Holdings spent on executive bonuses in a typical quarter. What would you do if you had unlimited resources? She asked, genuinely curious about his vision for the farm. Marcus's expression brightened as he considered the question. Solar-powered irrigation with soil moisture sensors throughout the property, he said without hesitation. Expand the greenhouse operation to extend our growing season. Install processing facilities so we can add value to our crops instead of just selling raw produce. Maybe even develop agritourism opportunities, farm-to-table dinners, educational programs for urban kids who've never seen where food comes from. Victoria could hear the passion in his voice as he described his vision, and she realized that Marcus wasn't just a farmer, he was an agricultural entrepreneur whose ideas were constrained only by lack of capital. That sounds amazing, she said sincerely. Have you ever considered looking for investors? Someone who might provide capital in exchange for partnership rather than outright purchase? Marcus looked at her with surprise, as if the idea hadn't occurred to him. I've never thought about that approach, he said slowly. I suppose I've always assumed that bringing in outside money would mean losing control of how the farm operates. Not necessarily, Victoria said, her mind racing with possibilities. The right kind of partnership could provide capital for improvements while preserving your operational control and family ownership. She was thinking about how Sterling Agricultural Holdings could restructure their approach to rural acquisitions, moving from outright purchase to strategic partnerships that supported rather than replaced existing operations. You seem to know a lot about business structures, Marcus observed with a smile. Maybe your corporate experience is more valuable than you realize. Victoria felt another pang of guilt about her deception, but she pushed it aside to focus on the possibilities she was beginning to envision. What if, she said carefully, someone were to approach you with that kind of partnership proposal? Capital for improvements, operational support, access to broader markets, but with guarantees about maintaining your family's control and farming philosophy? Marcus considered the question seriously, and Victoria could see him weighing the potential benefits against the risks of bringing outside parties into his operation. I'd be interested, he said finally, assuming the partner understood and respected what we're trying to accomplish here. The wrong kind of partnership could destroy everything my family has built. Victoria nodded, understanding that trust would be essential for any such arrangement to work. As the evening deepened and stars became visible in the clear desert sky, their conversation shifted to more personal topics. Marcus talked about his father's death and the weight of responsibility he'd felt taking over the farm. Victoria found herself sharing her own struggles with family expectations and the pressure to succeed in a corporate world that sometimes felt meaningless. Do you have Family? Marcus asked as they moved inside to escape the cooling desert air. Victoria felt the familiar tension of navigating personal questions. Without revealing too much about her background, "My parents," she said carefully, "my mother runs the company I work for. She's brilliant and successful. But we sometimes have different ideas about what success should look like." "That must be complicated," Marcus said with understanding. "Working with family can be challenging, especially when you're trying to find your own path." Victoria was struck by his insight into her situation, even with the limited information she provided. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you have family support for what you're doing with the farm?" "I have a sister in Phoenix," Marcus replied. "She's a teacher, married with 2 kids. She supports what I'm doing, but she also worries about the financial stress. Sometimes she suggests I might be happier with a more conventional career." Victoria could hear the affection and slight frustration in his voice when he talked about his sister's concerns. "But you don't agree?" "I think happiness comes from feeling like your work matters," Marcus said thoughtfully. "From being part of something larger than yourself. The farm connects me to my family's history, to the land, to the community. Even when it's financially challenging, it feels meaningful in a way that I'm not sure a corporate job would." Victoria found herself thinking about her own relationship with work and meaning. Her position at Sterling Agricultural Holdings provided financial security, professional prestige, and significant influence over corporate strategy. But sitting here with Marcus, she realized that her work had never provided the kind of deep satisfaction he was describing. "That's a beautiful way to think about work," she said softly. "What about you?" Marcus asked. "Does your work feel meaningful?" Victoria struggled to answer honestly, without revealing too much about her situation. "Sometimes," she said finally, "when I think about the potential for supporting sustainable agriculture and helping farming communities thrive. But sometimes, the corporate perspective feels disconnected from the human reality of what farming actually means to people like you." Marcus nodded with understanding, and Victoria could see that her struggle with corporate values resonated with him. "Maybe that's why you're here," he said gently, "to understand the human side of agriculture and find ways to bridge that gap." Victoria felt a surge of emotion at his words, which came closer to describing her evolving mission than anything she could have articulated. Her self-doubt as the evening wound down, Victoria found herself reluctant to return to her hotel. The farmhouse felt more like home than any place she'd been in years, and Marcus's company provided the kind of authentic connection that she'd never experienced. "I should probably head back," she said finally, though her tone made clear she didn't want to leave. "You're welcome to stay," Marcus said, then immediately looked embarrassed by the forwardness of the offer. "I mean, we have a guest room, and it's a long drive back to town in the dark." Victoria felt her heart skip at the invitation, recognizing that accepting would represent a significant step in their developing relationship. "I like that," she said softly, "if you're sure it's not an imposition." Marcus's smile was answer enough, and Victoria realized that staying at the farm felt more natural than returning to her impersonal hotel suite. Victoria woke Friday morning in the Rivera farmhouse guest room feeling more rested than she had in months. Sunlight filtered through curtains that Maria Rivera had sewn decades ago, and she could hear Marcus moving around in the kitchen, probably preparing for another day of manual irrigation. While waiting for his equipment parts, she dressed quickly and joined him in the kitchen, where he was making coffee with an old percolator that had probably been making Rivera family coffee for 30 years. "Good morning," he said with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Sleep well, better than I have in ages," Victoria replied honestly. "There's something peaceful about this place." Marcus handed her a cup of coffee, and their fingers brushed in a way that sent an unexpected jolt of electricity through Victoria's system. "The parts for the irrigation system are supposed to arrive this morning," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he learned not to count on such promises. "Once I get that running, I'll have more time to show you around the area. If you're still interested." Victoria was about to respond when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Catherine Sterling, and Victoria felt her stomach drop. Her mother rarely called unless something important was happening with the company, and the timing couldn't have been worse. "I should take this," Victoria said apologetically, stepping out onto the porch for privacy. "Victoria, darling." Her mother's voice carried the brisk efficiency that characterized all her communications. "I need you back in New York immediately." The Hartwell acquisition is moving faster than expected, and I need your analysis of the Southwest agricultural portfolio before the board meeting Monday. Victoria felt the weight of her corporate responsibilities crashing back into the peaceful world she'd been inhabiting for the past few days. I'm still conducting research here, Victoria said carefully. I need at least another week to complete the analysis properly. Research? Catherine's tone sharpened with impatience. Victoria, you're evaluating farmland for potential acquisition, not writing a doctoral dissertation. How much time do you need to assess production capacity and market value? Victoria realized her mother's purely financial perspective on the agricultural properties missed everything that actually mattered about places like the Rivera farm. It's more complicated than that, Victoria tried to explain. These operations represent entire communities and ways of life. The human factors are as important as the financial metrics. There was a pause before Catherine responded, and when she spoke, her tone carried the kind of carefully controlled frustration that Victoria remembered from childhood. Victoria, I'm concerned that you're allowing personal feelings to cloud your business judgment, Catherine said. These agricultural acquisitions are strategic investments, not charity projects. I need objective analysis based on financial potential, not romantic notions about family farming. The word romantic made Victoria wince, though she couldn't deny that her feelings about the Rivera farm had become deeply personal. I understand the business priorities, Victoria said, trying to keep her voice steady, but I think we should consider partnership models rather than outright acquisition. These operations could be more valuable as ongoing enterprises than as consolidated properties. Partnership models are complex and difficult to manage, Catherine replied dismissively. Outright acquisition gives us complete control over operations and development decisions. That's how we maximize value and minimize risk. Victoria found herself thinking about Marcus and the passionate way he described his vision for the farm's future. The idea of Sterling Agricultural Holdings taking complete control of the Rivera farm operation felt fundamentally wrong. What if maximizing short-term value isn't the best long-term strategy? Victoria asked. What if supporting existing operations could create more sustainable returns? Another pause, longer this time, and Victoria could almost hear her mother's patience wearing thin. Victoria, I'm going to be very clear, Catherine said in the tone she used for difficult personnel decisions. Your job is to identify properties suitable for acquisition and provide the financial analysis necessary for purchase decisions. If you're unable to maintain professional objectivity about these assignments, perhaps we need to reconsider your role in the company. The threat was unmistakable, and Victoria felt a familiar combination of anger and anxiety that her mother's ultimatums always produced. I'll have a preliminary report ready for Monday, Victoria said finally, knowing that resistance would only escalate the confrontation. Good, Catherine replied, her tone softening slightly. And Victoria, I know this kind of field research can be emotionally challenging. You're seeing hardworking people facing difficult circumstances, and your natural compassion makes you want to help. But remember that business decisions require clear thinking, not emotional reactions. After ending the call, Victoria stood on the porch for several minutes, trying to process the conversation and its implications. She was being forced to choose between her corporate responsibilities and her growing feelings for Marcus and his farm. The choice should have been obvious. Her career, her financial security, and her family relationships all depended on her position at Sterling Agricultural Holdings. But the thought of returning to New York to prepare an acquisition analysis of the Rivera farm made her feel physically sick. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind her, clearly sensing that something was wrong. Everything okay? He asked gently. Victoria turned to face him, and the genuine concern in his eyes made her decision for her. She couldn't continue the deception any longer. Marcus, there's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something important about who I am and why I'm really here. Marcus's expression grew serious, though he remained calm. Okay, he said simply. I'm listening. Victoria took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. My name is Victoria Sterling, she began, and my family owns Sterling Agricultural Holdings, one of the largest agricultural conglomerates in North America. I didn't come to Arizona for general research. I came here to evaluate specific farms for potential acquisition. She watched Marcus's face as he processed this information. seeing surprise give way to understanding and then to something that looked like hurt, including our farm. He asked quietly. Victoria nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Your operation was on the list of properties I was supposed to assess. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see him recontextualizing everything that had happened between them. So when you asked about partnership models and investment opportunities, he said slowly, you were actually conducting market research. It started that way, Victoria said desperately. But it's not that simple anymore. Everything I've learned here, everything I've felt, none of that was fake. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, putting physical distance between them as he struggled to process this revelation. How long have you known about our financial situation? He asked. About the irrigation problems, the equipment debt, the pressure from the bank. Victoria felt her heart breaking as she realized how her deception must appear to him. The initial research included financial data, she admitted, but I didn't understand what it really meant until I saw the farm. Until I met you, so you knew we were vulnerable, Marcus said, his voice flat. You knew we might be forced to sell. Victoria wanted to explain that her feelings had complicated everything, that she'd been questioning her entire mission since meeting him. But she could see that Marcus needed time to absorb the betrayal. I never intended for things to develop the way they have, she said softly. I never expected to care about you, about this place, about what it would mean to lose it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria could see him struggling between anger and the genuine connection they developed. I need to think about this, he said finally. I need to understand what's real and what was just part of your business assessment. Victoria felt tears threatening as she realized she might have destroyed the most meaningful relationship she'd ever experienced. Everything between us has been real, she said urgently. My feelings for you, my respect for what you built here, my belief that what you're doing matters, none of that was fake. But you were still planning to recommend our farm for acquisition, Marcus said. You were still going to return to New York and help your company take away everything my family has worked for. Victoria couldn't deny the truth of his accusation, and the weight of her divided loyalties felt crushing. I don't know what I was going to recommend, she said honestly. Everything has changed since I met you. Marcus nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. I think you should go, he said quietly. I need time to process this. You probably need to get back to your real life. Victoria felt her world collapsing, but she recognized that Marcus had every right to feel betrayed. She gathered her belongings in silence, aware that every moment might be the last she spent in the home that had begun to feel like her own. As she prepared to leave, Marcus spoke again. For what it's worth, he said without looking at her, I believe that your feelings were real, but I don't know if that's enough to overcome the fact that you've been lying to me. Since the moment we met, Victoria drove away from the Rivera farm, with tears streaming down her face, knowing that she had probably lost the most important thing that had ever happened to her. Back in her hotel room, Victoria stared at her laptop screen, trying to begin the acquisition report that her mother expected by Monday. The financial data for the Rivera farm was all their production levels, equipment values, debt obligations, market comparisons. From a purely business perspective, the farm represented an excellent acquisition opportunity. The property was well located with reliable water rights and fertile soil. The current operations were sophisticated enough to demonstrate the land's potential, but the family's financial pressures created an opportunity for below-market purchase. Sterling Agricultural Holdings could acquire the property, modernize the operations with corporate capital, and integrate it into their broader southwestern agricultural portfolio. But every time Victoria tried to write the recommendation, she found herself thinking about Marcus's passionate description of his family's legacy, about the community relationships that supported local agriculture, about the sustainable farming practices that prioritized long-term environmental health over short-term profits. Her phone rang, interrupting her attempt to focus on the report. She was surprised to see Marcus's name on the screen. Hello, she answered tentatively, unsure what to expect from the conversation. Victoria, Marcus's voice was carefully controlled. I've been thinking about what you told me, and I have some questions. Of course, Victoria said, sitting up straighter. I'll answer anything you want to know first. Marcus said, I want to understand your company's acquisition strategy. What happens to the farms you buy? Victoria had dreaded this question, because she knew Marcus wouldn't like the answer. It depends on the property, she said carefully. Sometimes we maintain existing operations if they're profitable. Sometimes we consolidate smaller farms into larger operational units. Sometimes we convert agricultural land to other uses if that provides better returns. At which category would our farm fall into? Marcus asked bluntly. Victoria looked at the financial projections on her screen, knowing that honesty would probably, and any chance of rebuilding their relationship, most likely consolidation, she admitted, your property would probably be combined with other holdings in the region to create a larger operational unit with economies of scale. Meaning what, exactly? Marcus pressed. Meaning the farmhouse would probably be demolished, the fields redesigned for machine efficiency, and the operations managed by corporate agricultural specialists rather than family farmers. Victoria said, feeling sick as she described the process. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for so long that Victoria wondered if Marcus had hung up. So everything my family built would disappear, he said finally. The agricultural productivity would be maintained, Victoria said weakly, knowing how hollow that sounded. But the family farm, the community connections, the sustainable practices, the local relationships, all of that would be gone, Marcus stated rather than asked. Yes, Victoria whispered, unable to pretend otherwise. Another long silence. Then Marcus spoke again with a tone Victoria had never heard from him before, cold and businesslike. I have a second question, he said. How long do families typically have to vacate properties after acquisition? Victoria felt her heart breaking as she realized Marcus was accepting the inevitability of losing his farm. Usually 60 to 90 days, she said. Though we try to be accommodating if families need additional time to relocate. How generous, Marcus said with bitter sarcasm. That was completely unlike his usual manner. Marcus, Victoria said desperately, it doesn't have to be this way. I've been thinking about alternative approaches, partnership models that could provide capital without requiring you to give up ownership or control. And does your company typically pursue those alternative approaches? Marcus asked. Victoria knew her answer would reveal everything about Sterling Agricultural Holdings' priorities. No, she admitted. We prefer acquisition because it gives us complete control over operations and eliminates potential conflicts with existing owners. So these partnership alternatives you're suggesting, they're not actually options your company would consider, Marcus said. Not under current policies, Victoria agreed reluctantly. Then why are you mentioning them? Marcus asked, his voice rising slightly. Are you trying to make me feel better about being displaced? Or are you suggesting that you have the power to change your company's fundamental business strategy? Victoria realized she had been offering false hope based on wishful thinking, rather than realistic possibilities. I don't know, she said honestly. I've been hoping I could find a way to convince my mother and the board that different approaches might be more beneficial long-term. But you don't actually have that authority, Marcus stated. No, Victoria admitted. I don't. Marcus was quiet for another long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was tired rather than angry. Victoria, I appreciate that you're trying to find solutions, but I think you need to be honest about what's really going to happen here. Your company is going to acquire our farm, whether you recommend it or not, because farms like ours are exactly what you're looking for: financially stressed properties that can be purchased below market value. Victoria wanted to deny it, but she knew Marcus was right. Sterling Agricultural Holdings had been systematically acquiring small farms throughout the Southwest, and the Rivera farm fit their criteria perfectly. It doesn't have to be your company, Victoria said desperately. There might be other buyers who would preserve the family operation at above market prices, Marcus asked skeptically. Victoria, you know the economics as well as I do. We're facing equipment debt, infrastructure problems, and cash flow issues that limit our options. Any buyer who's willing to pay enough to solve our financial problems is going to want operational control to protect their investment. Victoria realized that Marcus understood his situation more clearly than she did, and that her attempts to offer false hope were probably making things worse. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry for the deception, for the situation your farm is in, for everything. I know you are, Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. And I believe you never intended for things to develop the way they have. But the reality is that you represent a corporate interest that's fundamentally opposed to preserving and what my family has built. Victoria felt the weight of that truth settling over her like a heavy blanket. What happens now? She asked. quietly. "Now you go back to New York and write your report," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "And I start preparing my family for the possibility that we're going to lose the farm, Marcus." Victoria said, tears starting again. "I wish things could be different." "So do I," Marcus replied. "But wishing doesn't change the economic realities we're both facing." After hanging up with Marcus, Victoria sat in her hotel room, staring at the acquisition report she was supposed to complete. Everything in her corporate training told her to focus on the business fundamentals and ignore the emotional complications. Sterling Agricultural Holdings was a publicly traded company with obligations to shareholders, not a charitable organization dedicated to preserving family farms. But she couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's quiet resignation when he'd accepted that losing the farm was probably inevitable. The man who had spoken so passionately about his family's legacy and his vision for sustainable agriculture had been reduced to calculating how much time he would have to relocate after a corporate acquisition. Her phone rang again, and this time it was her mother. "Victoria, I wanted to check on your progress with the report," Catherine said without preamble. "The board meeting has been moved to Monday morning, so I'll need your analysis by Sunday evening." "It's nearly finished," Victoria lied, looking at the blank document on her screen. "Excellent," Catherine said. "I'm particularly interested in your assessment of that Rivera property. The preliminary financials suggest it could be an excellent acquisition opportunity." Victoria felt a surge of anger at her mother's casual reference to the Rivera farm as an opportunity. "Actually," Victoria said impulsively, "I think we should reconsider our acquisition strategy for that property." There was a pause before Catherine responded, and when she spoke, her tone was dangerously quiet. "Reconsider how?" "The current operations are more sophisticated and sustainable than typical small farms," Victoria said, trying to sound professional. "The family has developed innovative techniques that could be valuable to preserve rather than replace." "Victoria," Catherine said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child, "we're not acquiring farms to preserve their existing operations. We're acquiring land and assets to optimize their productive capacity within our corporate structure." "But what if maintaining existing operations could be more profitable long-term?" Victoria pressed. "What if these sustainable practices and community relationships create value that we lose through consolidation?" Catherine's response was immediate and definitive. "Victoria, you're allowing personal sentiment to cloud your business judgment. This is exactly what I was concerned about when you extended your stay in Arizona." "It's not sentiment," Victoria protested, though she knew her mother would dismiss any argument that didn't focus purely on financial metrics. "It's strategic thinking about maximizing asset value over the long term. Asset value is maximized through operational efficiency and scale economies," Catherine replied firmly, "not through sentimental attachment to traditional farming methods." Victoria realized that her mother was never going to understand the human dimensions of what they were doing, and that trying to argue on emotional grounds would only damage her credibility. "What if I could demonstrate that alternative approaches would generate better financial returns?" Victoria asked, changing tactics. "Then I would consider those alternatives," Catherine said. "But your job is to provide objective analysis, not to advocate for particular outcomes based on personal feelings." Victoria felt trapped between her corporate responsibilities and her growing conviction that Sterling Agricultural Holdings' approach to rural acquisition was both morally wrong and strategically short-sighted. "I'll have the report ready by Sunday," Victoria said finally, knowing she needed time to figure out how to reconcile her conflicting loyalties. After ending the call, Victoria found herself thinking about everything Marcus had taught her about farming, community, and what it meant to build something lasting. She realized that her month of research in the Southwest had educated her about far more than agricultural economics. It had shown her an entirely different way of thinking about success, relationships, and responsibility. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria found herself questioning whether her corporate career was really what she wanted to be doing with her life. Victoria spent Saturday morning walking through downtown Tucson, trying to clear her head and figure out what she was going to do about the report that was due Sunday evening. She had all the information she needed to write a standard acquisition recommendation, but she couldn't bring herself to start typing down. Instead, she found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Marcus about partnership models and alternative investment approaches. What if there really was a way to support farming operations like the Rivera farm without destroying what made them valuable? By afternoon, Victoria had developed the outline of a radically different approach to agricultural investment, one that focused on supporting existing operations rather than acquiring and consolidating them instead of purchasing farms outright. Sterling Agricultural Holdings could provide capital investment in exchange for partnership agreements that preserved family ownership while improving operational efficiency. The model would be more complex than simple acquisition, requiring ongoing management relationships rather than direct corporate control, but it could also generate more sustainable returns. While after ending the call, Victoria found herself thinking about everything Marcus had taught her about farming, community, and what it meant to build something lasting. She realized that her month of research in the Southwest had educated her about far more than agricultural economics. It had shown her an entirely different way of thinking about success, relationships, and responsibility. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria found herself questioning whether her corporate career was really what she wanted to be doing with her life. Victoria spent Saturday morning walking through downtown Tucson, trying to clear her head and figure out what she was going to do about the report that was due Sunday evening. She had all the information she needed to write a standard acquisition recommendation, but she couldn't bring herself to start typing. Instead, she found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Marcus about partnership models and alternative investment approaches. What if there really was a way to support farming operations like the Rivera farm without destroying what made them valuable? By afternoon, Victoria had developed the outline of a radically different approach to agricultural investment, one that focused on supporting existing operations rather than acquiring and consolidating them instead of purchasing farms outright. Sterling Agricultural Holdings could provide capital investment in exchange for partnership agreements that preserved family ownership while improving operational efficiency. The model would be more complex than simple acquisition, requiring ongoing management relationships rather than direct corporate control, but it could also generate more sustainable returns while preserving the community relationships and sustainable practices that gave these operations their real value. Victoria spent the rest of Saturday developing financial projections for her alternative model, using the Rivera farm as a case study. The numbers were compelling, providing capital for Marcus's irrigation improvements and operational upgrades would cost far less than purchasing the property outright, while generating steady returns through profit-sharing agreements. More importantly, the partnership approach would preserve everything that made the Rivera farm valuable, while supporting its growth and modernization. By Sunday evening, Victoria had completed two reports. The first was the acquisition analysis. Her mother expected a straightforward financial assessment that recommended purchasing the Rivera farm for consolidation into Sterling Agricultural Holdings Southwestern operations. The second was her alternative proposal, a comprehensive plan for agricultural partnerships that could support family farming operations while generating attractive returns. For corporate investors, Victoria knew that submitting the alternative proposal was risky. Her mother had made clear that she expected objective acquisition analysis, not creative business development suggestions. But Victoria also knew that she couldn't recommend the destruction of Marcus's farm without at least attempting to present a better alternative. She sent both reports to her mother Sunday night, along with a cover letter explaining her recommendation. For the partnership approach, Monday morning, Victoria's phone rang at 6 a.m. New York time. Victoria. Catherine's voice was ice cold. "We need to talk immediately." Victoria had been expecting this call, but she still felt her stomach drop at her mother's tone. "I'm flying back today," Victoria said. "We can discuss everything when I get to the office." "No," Catherine said firmly. "We're going to discuss this now. What exactly do you think you're doing with this partnership proposal?" Victoria took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would determine her future with the company. "I'm suggesting a more profitable approach to agricultural investment," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, one that could generate better long-term returns while reducing operational complexity. "Victoria, this partnership model is completely outside our core business strategy," Catherine replied. "We are not venture capitalists or agricultural consultants. We acquire assets, optimize their operations, and maximize returns through economies of scale." "But what if this approach could generate higher returns with lower risk?" Victoria pressed. What if supporting existing operations creates more value than replacing them? Catherine's response was immediate and final. Victoria, I'm going to be very clear about something. Your job is to identify acquisition opportunities and provide the analysis necessary for purchase decisions. It is not to redesign our fundamental business model based on romantic notions about family farming. Victoria felt her anger rising at her mother's dismissive tone. They're not romantic notions, she said firmly. They're business opportunities that we're missing because we're focused on short-term asset acquisition instead of long-term value creation. The silence that followed was long enough for Victoria to realize she had probably crossed a line from which there was no return. Victoria, Catherine said finally, her voice carrying the formal tone she used for terminating difficult employees. I think you need to take some time to reconsider your priorities and your commitment to this company. You're clearly too emotionally invested in these farming operations to provide objective business analysis. Victoria felt a strange sense of relief as she realized her mother was giving her an ultimatum. That made her choice clear. You're right, Victoria said calmly. I am emotionally invested, and I think that's exactly what this company needs more of: people who understand that business decisions have human consequences. Business decisions should be based on financial analysis, not emotional reactions. Catherine replied coldly. What if emotional understanding leads to better financial decisions? Victoria asked. What if caring about the people affected by our choices helps us identify opportunities that pure financial analysis misses? Catherine's response was immediate and definitive. Victoria, you have a choice to make. You can return to New York, apologize for this lapse in judgment, and resume your duties as a corporate acquisition analyst. Or you can continue down this path of emotional decision-making and find yourself looking for a new career. Victoria realized that her mother was offering her exactly the choice she'd been avoiding making for months. Between financial security and personal integrity, between corporate success and meaningful work. I choose meaningful work, Victoria said quietly. The silence that followed was profound, and Victoria could almost hear her mother's disappointment and frustration. I'm sorry you feel that way, Catherine said finally. Your resignation will be effective immediately. HR will contact you about final paperwork and benefit transitions. After ending the call, Victoria sat in her hotel room feeling simultaneously terrified and liberated. She had just walked away from a corporate position that provided financial security, professional prestige, and her entire social identity. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was making a decision based on her own values rather than external expectations. Her first call was to Marcus. It's Victoria, she said when he answered, hearing the wariness in his voice. I have something important to tell you. I just resigned from Sterling Agricultural Holdings. There was a long pause before Marcus responded. Why? He asked simply. Because I couldn't write a report recommending that your farm be acquired and consolidated, Victoria said. Because everything I've learned here has convinced me that what you're doing is more valuable than what my company wants to do with agricultural land. Victoria. Marcus was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if she'd overstepped again. Victoria, he said finally, I'm still trying to process everything that's happened between us. The deception, the revelation about your company, your resignation, it's a lot to absorb. Victoria felt her heart sink, realizing that professional partnership might not be possible given the personal complications between them. I understand, she said quietly. I've damaged your trust, and I can't expect you to. I didn't say no, Marcus interrupted gently. I said I need to process it. What you're proposing could be exactly what family farmers need, and your resignation suggests that your commitment to the idea is genuine. Victoria felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. What would you need to feel comfortable considering a partnership? She asked. Time, Marcus said immediately. Time to understand whether what happened between us personally can be separated from what we might build together professionally. Victoria nodded, even though he couldn't see her. And honestly, Marcus continued, I need to see that you're committed to this new direction for the long term, not just acting on emotional impulse that you might regret later. How can I demonstrate that commitment? Victoria asked. Marcus considered for a moment. Stay in Arizona, he said finally, not as a guest in our community, but as someone building a life here. Learn about agricultural finance from the farmer's perspective, not just the investor side. Show that you're serious about understanding our world before asking us to trust you with our futures. Victoria felt a thrill of excitement at the suggestion, even though it meant completely rebuilding her life in an unfamiliar place. "I like that," she said, more than I could probably express, and Victoria, Marcus's voice carried a warmth that she hadn't heard since before her revelation. "Yes, thank you for choosing us over them. Regardless of what happens between us personally, that decision matters more than you probably realize." 6 months later, Victoria stood in the office of Sterling Agricultural Partnership, a converted building in downtown Tucson that served as headquarters for the investment firm she'd founded with Marcus as her operational partner. The walls were covered with maps showing partner farms throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, along with photographs of the farming families whose operations they supported. The business model they developed was exactly what Victoria had envisioned during her last days at Sterling Agricultural Holdings. Instead of acquiring farms, Sterling Agricultural Partnership provided capital investment in exchange for profit-sharing agreements that preserved family ownership, while funding operational improvements. Their first client had been the Rivera farm, where new solar-powered irrigation systems had increased efficiency by 40% while reducing water usage. Marcus had used the partnership capital to expand his greenhouse operations and install processing facilities that allowed the farm to add value to their crops, rather than just selling raw produce. But the Rivera farm was no longer unique. Sterling Agricultural Partnership now supported 17 family farming operations across the Southwest, each one maintaining their individual character while benefiting from shared resources, marketing support, and technical expertise. "The Henderson farm called again," Marcus said, entering the office with the kind of smile that had become familiar over the months they'd worked together. "Jim wants to discuss converting from his current operation to our partnership model." Victoria looked up from the financial projections she'd been reviewing, pleased but not surprised by the news. Henderson's purely efficiency-focused approach had proven vulnerable to market fluctuations and environmental challenges, while their partner farms had shown consistent profitability through diversification and sustainable practices. "What changed his mind?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "His latest equipment loan was denied," Marcus replied. "Bank told him that his debt-to-income ratio was too high for additional borrowing, even though his operation generates good revenue." Victoria nodded, recognizing the bind that many farmers found themselves in, successful enough to appear profitable, but lacking the capital reserves to invest in improvements or weather unexpected challenges. "Are you interested in taking him on?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did all their partnership decisions. "His land is good, and he's shown he can produce consistent yields," Marcus said, "but he'd need to transition away from some of his chemical-intensive practices to fit with our sustainability standards." "Think he'd be willing to make those changes if it means avoiding bankruptcy?" "Probably," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "Amazing how financial pressure can open people's minds to new approaches." Victoria laughed, remembering her own resistance to changing her perspective on agricultural investment before circumstances forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about business and success. "Schedule a meeting with him next week," she decided. "We can walk him through the partnership model and see if he's serious about transitioning to sustainable practices." As Marcus made notes about the Henderson meeting, Victoria found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when her Tesla had broken down on a desert highway. She'd gone from a corporate executive focused purely on financial metrics to a business owner dedicated to supporting family agriculture and sustainable farming practices. More importantly, she discovered what it meant to build something meaningful rather than just profitable, to be part of a community rather than just an economic entity. "Any word from your mother?" Marcus asked, noting the thoughtful expression on Victoria's face. Victoria smiled ruefully at the question. Catherine Sterling had not approved of her daughter's career change, to put it mildly. There had been several months of strained communication before they managed to establish a civil relationship based on agreeing to disagree about business philosophy. "Actually, yes," Victoria said, surprising herself with the answer. "She called yesterday to say that Sterling Agricultural Holdings is reconsidering their acquisition strategy in the Southwest." Marcus looked up with interest. "Apparently, our partnership model is generating enough attention in the agricultural investment community that they're losing potential deals to investors who offer farmers alternatives to outright sale. Victoria continued, "And how does she feel about that?" Marcus asked with obvious amusement. "She's still convinced I'm pursuing a romantic fantasy that will eventually prove unsustainable," Victoria replied. But she also admitted that our year-one returns are better than they projected for most of their agricultural acquisitions. Marcus nodded approvingly. Financial success was still important, even when it wasn't the only measure of value. "Speaking of returns," Victoria said, pulling up another document on her computer, "the quarterly reports from our partner farms are all looking strong. The Morales operation is up 18% over last year. The Chen farm is expanding into agritourism like we discussed. And your tomatoes are commanding premium prices." From restaurants in Phoenix and Tucson, Marcus's satisfaction was evident as he reviewed the numbers. After months of financial stress and uncertainty about the farm's future, the partnership with Victoria had not only stabilized the Rivera operation, but positioned it for growth and expansion. "Any regrets?" Victoria asked, a question that had become their informal check-in about both their business partnership and their personal relationship. Marcus considered seriously, as he did most questions about the business partnership. "None at all," he said. "You've helped us build something that's both financially sustainable and true to our values. That's exactly what family farmers need." And personally, Victoria asked, though she was no longer worried about his answer. Marcus's smile was answer enough, but he answered anyway. "Personally, I'm grateful every day for that morning when you needed help and I decided to stop," he said. "Even though it started with deception, it led to the most honest relationship I've ever had." Victoria felt the familiar warmth that Marcus's presence brought to her life. Their romantic relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on the foundation of genuine respect and shared values rather than the initial attraction that had complicated their business interactions. "What about you?" Marcus asked. "Any regrets about walking away from corporate success?" Victoria looked around the office they'd built together, thinking about the farming families they supported and the sustainable business model they created. "Only one," she said with a smile. Marcus raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I regret that it took me so long to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life," Victoria said. "But I suppose some discoveries can only happen when you're ready for them. And when your Tesla breaks down in exactly the right place," Marcus added with a laugh. Victoria joined his laughter, thinking about the chain of coincidences and choices that had brought them together. Her car breaking down, Marcus's decision to stop and help, her choice to extend her stay in Arizona, the growing connection that had forced her to choose between corporate loyalty and personal integrity. "Do you think it was fate?" she asked, a question they debated many times over the past months. "I think," Marcus said thoughtfully, "that fate is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And we were both prepared for something we didn't even know we were looking for." Victoria nodded, satisfied with that explanation. She'd been prepared for a different kind of success that Sterling Agricultural Holdings offered, even though she hadn't recognized it until meeting Marcus showed her the alternative. He'd been prepared for partnership and growth, even though his financial situation had seemed to limit his options. "So what's next?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Victoria pulled up the business plan they'd been developing for expanding Sterling Agricultural Partnership throughout the Southwest. "Next, we help more families keep their farms while building the kind of agricultural network that can compete with corporate agriculture on sustainability and profitability," she said. "We proved that family farming isn't just a romantic ideal, but a viable business model for the 21st century." "Ambitious goals," Marcus observed with approval. "Shared goals," Victoria corrected. "That's what makes them achievable." As they settled into planning their next phase of expansion, Victoria thought about the letter she'd received the previous week from a business school professor who wanted to write a case study about Sterling Agricultural Partnership's innovative approach to agricultural investment. The professor had been particularly interested in how personal relationships and community values could be successfully integrated with sophisticated financial structures. Victoria had agreed to the case study, hoping it might inspire other investors to consider partnership models rather than acquisition strategies. But what the professor couldn't capture in a business case was the personal transformation that had made the professional success possible. Victoria's willingness to choose values over financial security Marcus's decision to trust someone who had initially deceived him. Their shared commitment to building something meaningful, rather than just profitable. The sun was setting over the Catalina Mountains as Victoria and Marcus finished their planning session and prepared to head home to the Rivera farm, where Victoria now lived in the renovated guest house that had become her permanent residence. As they drove through the desert landscape that had become home, Victoria reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning when she'd awakened in a New York penthouse as the heir to an agricultural conglomerate focused on acquisition and consolidation. Now she awakened each morning in a small house on a family farm, dedicated to preserving and supporting the kind of agriculture that prioritized sustainability over efficiency, community over profit, and long-term stewardship over short-term gains. Happy? Marcus asked as they pulled into the familiar driveway, lined with eucalyptus trees that Eduardo Rivera had planted 70 years ago. Happier than I ever imagined possible, Victoria replied, meaning every word. As they walked toward the farmhouse where 3 generations of Rivera families had lived and worked, Victoria thought about the legacy they were now building together, not just for themselves, but for the farming families whose operations they supported and the communities that depended on sustainable agriculture. It was a different kind of legacy than the one she would have inherited as Sterling Agricultural Holdings, but it was one that felt authentic and meaningful in ways that corporate success never had. Thank you, she said to Marcus as they reached the porch where they'd had so many important conversations over the past year. For what? He asked. For stopping that morning when I needed help, Victoria said. For giving me a chance to understand what I really wanted to do with my life. Marcus smiled, pulling her close as the stars became visible in the clear desert sky. Thank you for breaking down in exactly the right place, he replied, and for choosing us over them when it mattered most. As they stood together on the porch of the farmhouse that had sheltered for generations of Rivera families and would, hopefully, shelter many more, Victoria realized that the story that had begun with a stranded motorist and a helpful farmer had become something neither of them could have anticipated. A love story that was also a business partnership, a professional success that was also a personal transformation, and a chance encounter that had become the foundation for building something lasting and meaningful. Sometimes, Victoria thought as she looked out over the fields that Marcus's family had cultivated for 7 decades, the most important journeys begin with getting lost, and sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never knew you were looking for, until someone with calloused hands and a generous heart shows you the way home. Sterling Agricultural Partnership had grown to support over 50 family farming operations across 6 states, with Victoria and Marcus recognized as leaders in sustainable agricultural investment. Their model had been studied by business schools, implemented by other investment firms, and credited with helping preserve hundreds of family farms that might otherwise have been lost to corporate consolidation. But their greatest success wasn't measured in financial returns or business awards. It was measured in the children who grew up on family farms that remained in family hands, in the communities that maintained their agricultural heritage, and in the knowledge that it was possible to build prosperity without sacrificing the values that made prosperity meaningful. The Rivera farm itself had become a model for sustainable desert agriculture, hosting tours for agricultural students and policymakers who wanted to understand how family farming could thrive in the modern economy. The farmhouse that Eduardo Rivera had built in the 1950s now sheltered Marcus and Victoria's own family twin daughters who were already learning to drive the tractor and understand the complex relationships between soil, water, plants, and people that made agriculture both an art and a science. And sometimes, when the desert wind was just right and the sun was setting over the Catalina Mountains, Victoria would remember that morning when her Tesla had broken down on a lonely highway, and she would marvel at how one act of kindness from a stranger had changed not just her life, but the lives of hundreds of farming families throughout the Southwest. It was, she often thought, the best breakdown that had ever happened to anyone.